it's actually called the Axial and Appendicular Skeleton. It's right after exercise 5. It's sort of a new exercise, and it's going to take us through the actual bones. So when we think of this, if you remember when we did the anatomical landmarks, we talked about axial, which is the main axis, and so that's going to include, in the case of the skeleton, the skull and the vertebral column, as well as the sternum and the ribs. That's all part of the axial skeleton. And then the appendicular skeleton, which is the girdles, this shoulder girdle, which is formed from the scapula and clavicle, is called the pectoral girdle. And then the appendages, both the arms and the legs, would be part of the appendicular skeleton. Again, with the legs, it includes both the pelvic girdle and the bones that form the leg itself. So we're going to work with the axial skeleton first. They show you a diagram that you could take some time and actually label the individual bones on, or again use the Connect website to help guide you through learning the names. And it really is repetition. The great thing about learning the 206 bones of the body is that once you learn them, they don't change. Occasionally we find a new bone, but it's very, very rare. It's more likely to find a new muscle. The bones have been pretty well described. But sometimes there are new features that are noticed or identified. So when we think of the axial skeleton, the skull, the vertebral column, the ribs, and the sternum, I'm going to start with this nice colored skull, so I think it'll help you really see the different bones clearly. You can see them pretty well on your models though, so you'll get to build your skeleton from your lab kit, and I think you'll find it really handy for this exercise. So when we think of the skull, the main function of the skull, of course, would be to protect our brains, which are really very soft. So when we think about the skull, or the cranial bones, they're really very large bones. In an adult, they're fused together. In an infant, the bones actually are somewhat softer, and the points where they meet, or the sutures where they meet, are not completely sealed or hardened. That's why we talk about the soft spot on a baby's head. And that's going to help the baby actually emerge through the mother's vaginal canal during delivery. But when we think of a nice adult specimen here, this sort of main bone up front is called the frontal bone. So easy to remember in this model. It's sort of a yellowish color, and there's one frontal bone. There are then two parietal bones. They're green on this model, and you can see the suture down the middle between them. And these two parietal bones, or the upper sides of the skull, again, are helping to form that cranium. Towards the posterior aspect, the blue one here is the occipital bone. The occipital bone has a pretty amazing feature. It's got a very large hole in it. It's called the foramen magnum, which basically means large hole, and that's to accommodate the spinal cord, which is going to pass through this so that it can interact and communicate with the brain. So occipital bone has that very large foramen magnum. So frontal, parietal, occipital. The lower sides of the skull are formed from the temporal bones. The temporal bones are sort of brown on this model. So again, two temporal bones, two parietal bones. You'll notice that towards the anterior aspect that the temporal bone is going to meet up with what we think of as the cheekbones, or zygomatic bones. And on this model, those are yellow, so those two cheekbones, or if you think of the cheek arches, that's going to be helping to form those. And as we move towards the front then, or the facial bones, we notice a few sort of obvious surface bones. I'll focus on those first. These two sort of smaller white bones are called the nasal bones. It's where the nose cartilage would attach. You notice that in the skull, cartilage really doesn't remain, that all that's left after decomposition is really going to be the nasal bones. You've got these two sort of purplish bones in this model called the maxilla, or maxillae, plural, and those are sometimes called the upper jaw bones. If you're able to see in this model, you'll notice, and if you just take your tongue and put it up on the roof of your mouth, what we think of as the hard palate is really formed from those maxillae. That's going to be meeting later with what we call the palatine bones, and then there's some membranes to help form the soft palate so we can swallow, so we can accommodate swallowing the food. We have a single mandible. It's really the only articulated or jointed bone in the skull, and the mandible is a very large bone that houses those lower teeth. Let's see. It's a little bit more difficult to see the internal structures, but if you notice this sort of reddish bone, this reddish bone is called the sphenoid bone. In your model, it's going to be very difficult to see on that skull because it's going to be fused with everything. But that red bone or sphenoid bone is sort of a butterfly shape, and it's going to help to form the eye sockets. It's going to coordinate with this yellowish sort of internal bone called the ethmoid bone. It's almost a little cube-shaped bone, and that ethmoid bone is going to help allow the nerves to pass from your nasal cavity up to your brain. It's got tiny little perforations called the cribriform plate. So those are the main bones that I'm going to want you to be familiar with. Again, in your exercise, they're going to walk you through those, and they're going to be giving you some more detail in terms of the names of the sutures. I'm not so worried about that for this course, but it's certainly interesting and you can read about it. And it's got some labeling, so it's actually got them labeled for you. And then, as I said, if you go to Get Body Smart, it'll test you and you can kind of get your answers right away, instant feedback to find out